We are delighted to have Rita Vaughan Frost here today with us. Rita has a passion for protecting forests and the people that depend on them. With more than a decade of organizing experience against extractive corporate interests, Rita focuses on the intersection of energy and land to ensure that policy serves forests, community, and the climate. Rita is a forest advocate with NRDC. And with that, I'd like to see if we could unmute Rita and so that she can begin her talk. One more time. Great.
Okay, there we go. Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. Thank y'all also to the Stop Clearcutting campaign, especially to Brittany to helping me advance my slides. I'm really excited to be here because I have worked to defend against the wood pellet production industry in the Southeast for nearly 9 years. I've worked with communities that are confronting the wood pellet manufacturing industry in that region. I'm a born and raised Southerner. Now I live in the Pacific Northwest. I live on traditional Kalapuya lands. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm working on campaigns to stop the wood pellet manufacturing industry's new sourcing region, which they're trying to make be the Pacific Northwest. I'm working on campaigns in California, Oregon, and in Washington. And the Stop GSNR campaign is one of the campaigns that is part of that portfolio. Not only do I have expertise in this area, but Natural Resources Defense Council has also been working on wood pellet manufacturing, bioenergy issues for decades. Cumulatively, we have campaigns that we run in Europe, in the United Kingdom, at the US federal level, and also with partner organizations in the Southeast. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Because before I get into the specifics of Golden State Natural Resources, which is really the entity I want to dive into detail about, I actually want to just start with a basic Forest Biomass 101 and to answer the question of what is forest biomass, because it's a very vague term. But biomass is simply any living or recently living organic matter that's used for fuel. Its sources can vary widely. It can be trees, agricultural crops like corn and sugarcane, algae. It can even include landfill waste, and it can be transformed into nearly as many different forms of bioenergy, including electricity and vehicle fuel. In all cases, it's converting energy from the sun that plants have stored via photosynthesis into energy that we use as humans. When I'm going to be discussing the biomass industry today, or when I talk about wood pellets today, I am specifically referring to woody biomass, biomass that comes from forests, and I'm talking about its end use as an industrial scale use at industrial scale in power stations for countries' electricity and or heat, because those are the sorts of projects that NRDC works against. The wood pellet biomass industry, as I kind of previewed in my own introduction, has been established in the Southeast for nearly a decade. I personally have tracked and traced it at the ground level for 9 of those years. This is actually a photo taken while I was investigating a harvest in a bottomland hardwood forest of North Carolina back in 2018. The industry in the Southeast was predicated on using waste and residues. And yet what we found every time we went out in the field, whether it was by ourselves, with investigative journalists, or with policymakers, was we were finding more logging and worse logging. We are still finding an incredible amount of scraps left behind. Once the industry was locked in place, once the facilities were built, once the export terminals were established, the Southeast became locked into an industry where logging was increasing and getting worse. And anytime I bring up the Southeast or my history in the Southeast, the reason I'm doing it is because I'm hoping that it highlights the potential harms that we could face in California, in Oregon and Washington, but especially in California today with the presentation, if Golden State Natural Resources or another industrial scale wood pellet producer gains a foothold. Okay, Brittany, we can go to the next slide. Oh, actually, let's go back. Thank you. Thank you. We also want to ask the question when we're talking about Forest Biomass 101 of like, how does the process of industrial scale export oriented wood pellet biomass actually work? And the reason why I lay it out schematically is because following the journey of a wood pellet will take you thousands of miles and even across oceans. Whole trees are sourced from forests. They are trucked to facilities. In the case of GSNR, they could be trucked up to 100 miles away to a facility. They are then dried and processed into pellets in facilities that are really noisy. They're polluting, they're disruptive. They are again put back on either 18-wheelers or rail, and they're transported to ports. They're stored at ports where they can become a fire and explosion risk. That's a photo from a wood pellet fire in Texas, which is actually my home state. And then they are again put on ocean-going vessels, brought to utilities in foreign countries, and they are combusted in a power plant, and the country labels it as renewable energy. Let's go to the next slide. However, calling it quote unquote renewable energy comes with a dire warning from scientists because it's really only renewable on paper and not to anyone that is using climate change timelines. So let's break that down. Cutting down in trees and then burning them to make electricity is not a climate solution. In fact, burning forest biomass produces more carbon dioxide per unit of energy generated than fossil fuels, which you can simply see modeled with the PFPI graph that's on the right. That's our partnership for policy integrity. The erroneous argument relies on biomass emissions being reabsorbed by forest growth. However, growing trees to maturity takes time, and burning forest biomass increases emissions in the atmosphere on the low end of 44 years and the high end of centuries. This is what is also referred to as the carbon payback period. Furthermore, an NRDC study, which is the one on the left, thoroughly debunks the carbon neutrality arguments used by the wood pellet and forest biopower industries to demonstrate that wood pellets from forests will not deliver any climate benefits. We included upstream life cycle emissions. So that is all the emissions that are happening before it actually gets to the smokestack. You can see that we have included in there foregone sequestration, slash decay, transport and processing, drying, and then the eventual stack emissions, just to segregate it out and show how many emissions are coming from each step of the process. No matter what, even if you exclude the emissions that come from the power plant, which are the most emissive part of the process, these emissions can exceed the average emissions generated from the US electrical grid. This study really underscored the dire warning from other scientists that have been communicated to decision makers for years, including this letter that I link and use in kind of like the lower right-hand side. This was a letter that was signed by winners of the Nobel Prize, the US Medal of Science, lead authors of multiple IPCC reports. They wrote to the European Union because the European Union is where bioenergy is subsidized the most. They said, quote, using wood deliberately harvested from burning will increase carbon in the atmosphere and warming for decades to centuries. This is really important because on timelines to tackle climate change, we don't have that amount of time. We cannot wait 44 years to centuries. We need to be addressing the amount of emissions that are being increased in the atmosphere right now. Let's go to the next slide. This gets into some of the drivers of forest biomass energy. The whole reason why it's being turned to as an energy source is that countries want to meet ambitious emissions reduction targets, which we agree with. They should be reducing their emissions, but not through burning forest biomass. Countries in the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Asia treat biomass as carbon neutral, and they subsidize the efforts of energy companies that are burning biomass. The EU, let me be very clear, they have become very reliant on biomass to meet their climate goals. It's a total 60% of their renewable energy usage, actually. The biomass industry is dependent on forests in the US because we have a much bigger wood basket than the European Union or the United Kingdom or Asia have. We grow forests really well in North America, and that is leading them to be exploited by the wood pellet biomass industry. In the past decade, since the original renewable energy policies incentivized biomass, wood pellet exports from the US have increased 500%. When the renewable energy policies were first created, there were nearly zero mills in the southern United States, and now there are nearly 40. During my own tenure of working on industrial scale wood pellet biomass, we have stopped 4 facilities in the US Southeast. Each of those facilities were stopped before they were built. So we are at a critical moment in California to stop these industrial scale facilities that GSNR is proposing to build. We are at that juncture to stop them now. This driver, as I said, it's an external market. This external market has a constant demand for wood. Between 2015 and 2021, you'll see this in the chart on the right-hand side, the forest biomass industry received $50 billion in subsidies. And this is part of the reason why our campaign is concerned about Golden State Natural Resources. We are concerned that these subsidies will push the project to far outstrip any sort of ecological management done for California forests. Instead, it will be a primary industry serving an overseas market that will constantly need to be fed once it is built and once the contracts are signed. Let's go to the next slide. This is just a chart I put together about the bad business of biomass because I want to quickly pivot us to talk about Golden State Natural Resources. But the reason why I put this together is because I believe history is a potent guide. And the industry's track record in the Southeast, as well as in British Columbia, we've really learned that forest biomass at the end of the day is not cool, it's not clean, it's not just, it's not economic, and it's not necessary. So I've listed out some of the industry's behavior to show you that they cannot be financially solvent without subsidies. So first of all, Enviva, which is the world's largest wood pellet manufacturer in the world, they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy just back in March, just a month ago, March 12th. So even with the help of billions of dollars in government subsidies, this company's operations have continued to struggle. Furthermore, Drax, which is the world's second largest wood pellet manufacturer, they are heavily subsidized by the United Kingdom. And right now, it has been made note of every time we check their annual results that they actually wouldn't be in the green if they weren't receiving subsidies from the United Kingdom. And these subsidies are coming from renewable energy policies. That means that they are up for political debate and they could change at any moment. Secondly, this industry has been accused of environmental racism, specifically Drax. And this is because the wood pellet biomass industry sites their wood pellet plants in majority Black communities that have high poverty rates. In fact, a study established that facilities are 50% more likely to be located in an environmental justice community than not. Thirdly, they have a history of non-compliance. The wood pellet industry racks up fines from regulators everywhere they go. This is even in the polluter-friendly region of the Southeast. In a decade's worth of time, 59 state enforcement actions have resulted in nearly $7 million in fines. And some of the largest fines are coming from places like Louisiana and Mississippi, definitely the most polluter-friendly of the polluter-friendly states. Drax itself, that's that #2 wood pellet producer in the world, they have paid 2 settlements of $1.6 million apiece to the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality for air pollution violations. And in 2019, Drax was also fined $2.5 million for air pollution violations in Mississippi. Finally, this has culminated in lawsuits that are knocking at the wood pellet manufacturers' doors. Currently, there are 2 investor class action securities fraud suits and 2 shareholder derivative class action suits against players in the wood pellet manufacturing industry. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Brittany. So with that background out of the way, I want to turn to California and talk about the project that we are working to stop. Golden State Natural Resources, also shortened to GSNR, proposes 2 wood pellet facilities in California and 1 export terminal. And we are worried that this threatens to create ongoing logging demand in California forests and spread the biomass industry's harmful legacy into local California communities. The facilities are proposed, 1 in Lassen County and 1 in Tuolumne County. These combined facilities would produce up to 1 million tons of wood pellets every year. That takes nearly 2 million tons of fiber to create. and they would be exported most likely to Asian energy markets. It's not clear, so it could also be European. There, they would be burned in industrial power plants, and it would be classified as renewable energy. The map on the right-hand side indicates GSNR sourcing radius. And the reason why I wanted to include that is that it's actually a pretty recent map from Golden State Natural Resources. Before, they were just telling us a 100-mile radius, and now we have some more specifics. Furthermore, we have been receiving documents through Public Records Act requests, and we've learned that GSNR wants to use 60 to 70% whole trees for their feedstock. This accompanied by the fact that they are industrial scale, intended for export energy markets and combustion and utilities, shows to us that GSNR's proposal goes beyond forest resiliency by threatening to create an industrial complex that will require constant and increasing amount of trees to feed their supply needs. Next slide. There are a couple of red flags that I want to wave for y'all. First being Drax. I mentioned them a couple times already based off of their history in the Southeast. GSNR recently announced an agreement with UK-based Drax. They have a history of misleading statements. They've been caught sourcing old growth forest from Canada. That's actually that image on the right-hand side that came out of a very recent BBC expose. I think it was in the past month or so. And as I also mentioned, they've been accused of environmental racism in the Southeast. Next slide. Another flag we wanted to raise is there's a serious conflict of interest going on here. GSNR is a nonprofit. They were co-founded by a state agency, that's GSFA, as well as a service organization, RCRC, that represents California's rural counties. GSFA happens to be not only one of their co-founders, but they're also the primary funder of GSNR. They've loaned GSNR a total of almost $12 million as of June 2023. And in-kind donations from RCRC has racked up to nearly $2.5 million. For those that are really familiar with the California Environmental Quality Act, also called CEQA, GSFA is the lead agency for GSNR's draft environmental impact report, which we're expecting any day between this quarter and next. The other weird thing to mention to y'all, for those who are familiar with CEQA, is that neither GSFA nor RCRC are permitting authorities. So it's kind of an interesting case for us. Next slide. Okay, so over the next, I think, 8 to 10 slides here, I'm going to go pretty quick because I'm actually going to include images that I have taken while I've been doing the on the ground truthing of the wood pellet production industry to show y'all what I've experienced in the Southeast, what investigative journalists have backed up, as well as other watchdog organizations. Because the industry claims to use waste, residues, and other. In fact, many of the same statements that GSNR is making right now to California policymakers, as well as the U.S. Forest Service, are echoing what we heard from the wood pellet production industry in the Southeast. But we have exposed their damaging logging practices through investigations year after year to just plainly show what it looks like for people to be able to make their own interpretations of how we are defining certain terms. Because the industry will persist in using language that they're taking wastes, residues, unmerchantable trees. Definitely not how wildlife or the climate use these forests. Next slide. One of the important things for us at NRDC is that when forests are logged, the trees can no longer sequester carbon. And we think that that is a very high value of our forests, especially mature and old growth forests. Furthermore, we are very concerned about biodiversity because right now, not only are we facing a climate change crisis, but we are also facing one of the world's most massive extinction events. We are at a time when our planet faces the extinction of 1 million species, and all of the logging that has occurred in the Southeast for the wood pellet manufacturing industry is occurring in the North Atlantic coastal plain biodiversity hotspot. It just happens to be one of 2 biodiversity hotspots in the US. And I know y'all being from California probably understand that the other hotspot is the California floristic province. And this is where GSNR hopes to source wood for their pellets. Next slide. piles aren't being displaced by the wood pellet manufacturing industry in the Southeast. In fact, that material is too fine, it's too small to be processed by wood pellet plants. So we are continuing to find residues and waste and piles still left over after wood pellet harvests. Next slide. Again, this is a investigation that I did back in 2018 that we actually went back to a number of times with other scientists so that we could really understand some of the forest impacts here and some of the ecosystem service impacts here, because this was just this was an especially damning cut that we found. It was 100-acre, 100-plus-year-old clear cut that we found back in 2018. It's along the Meherrin River. And again, protecting forests is really a key strategy in halting climate change, not just because it's going to take away the sequestering power of those forests, not only because it can no longer protect for the habitat that lived there, but also because of surface drinking water, and also because, at least in the Southeast, and we can talk about how this applies to California, but in the Southeast, forests that are in the area that are being sourced for wood pellet manufacturing are also the forests that are most helpful to communities in soaking up the extra water that's coming from hurricanes and floods, which are the climate change impacts that the Southeast is facing right now. Next slide. We think that there is a real risk that GSNR is going to create a similar situation that the Southeast has seen. And that is one in which forest harvests have actually exceeded growth. So let me get into that a little bit. There was a study done by Clark University in 2022, and they determined that there was a net loss of forested area, which highlights the misleading nature of many of the industry's main arguments. Instead of enhancing forest carbon and decreasing emissions, wood pellet biomass developments are actually undermining global efforts at addressing climate change. Next slide. This is one of the facilities. This is what they look like from the air. This is actually the Sampson County facility. It produces about 600,000 tons per year of pellets. And just to get an understanding of the size, you can check out those 18-wheelers lined up to come and drop off their logs. This facility is the one that I decided to include in this presentation because it's actually going to be smaller than one of GSNR's proposed facility. This facility in Sampson County produces 600,000 tons per year. The facility that GSNR is proposing in Lassen County will produce 700,000 tons per year. Next slide. This is just to go back again. This was another wetland forest cut back in 2016. Next slide. And again, that's the view from the air. Okay, next slide. One of the things that I really want to make mention of in relation to Golden State Natural Resources and placing ourselves back into California is that GSNR is positioning their project as one of wildfire mitigation and resilience. And those are goals that I think we can all get behind. California continues to struggle with the issue of large-scale fuel treatments and community risk reduction. Those are incredibly important in the era of climate change. And while they are related, they have different objectives. So when it comes to the broad-scale thinning that GSNR is proposing in order to reduce fire severity, scientists are actually telling us that that will result in more carbon emissions than would be released by fire, creating a multi-decade carbon deficit that conflicts with climate goals. And as we already spelled out, it has been clearly identified by the scientific community that burning pellets as the end goal of those fuel reduction projects would increase carbon in the atmosphere for decades to centuries. So if we want to stop the destruction of entire communities, NRDC is supportive and working with policymakers to try to recognize that the problem is ignitable structures, and that we need to be focusing on the home ignition zone, as well as creating community defensible space, good ingress and egress routes, community evacuation plans, smoke shelters, and ways to mitigate the harms of wildfires, as well as to keep community members safe in the face of increasing wildfires. Furthermore, when it comes to trying to find an economic tie to the wood pellet production industry, sometimes we hear the argument that you need the wood pellet production industry in order to get the forest treatments done. Well, to be frank, California and the US Forest Service have never had more money than they do now for wildfire suppression. That's the graph on the left. So any claims that a market driver is needed for fuels reduction work is dubious at best. As I've shown with NRDC's work in the Southeast and in Canada, we have seen that when the market is driving the product development, ecological management goals are cast aside. So when it comes to forest management decisions in relation to wildfire mitigation, NRDC is pushing for non-commercial end uses, and wood pellets do not fit into that category. Next slide. I'll be quick here. I have only a couple more slides. I want to also underscore that there are major public health impacts from wood pellet production facilities. This is over and beyond the biopower manufacturing facilities. So for instance, I know that California has a number of bioenergy facilities, and there are a lot of health harms that communities have complained about for enough time that they should be paid attention to. There are also health harms that are associated with wood pellet manufacturing, and that is why communities in the Southeast have been so vocal against wood pellet manufacturing facilities, because they have seen their health directly impacted because of all the particulate matter, because of the HAPs, because of the VOCs, and importantly, as I noted earlier, because the industry is very accustomed to breaking the law. They break the Clean Air Act time and time again, and every time they do that and they go over and above and beyond their emissions limits, the communities are the ones that are facing the impact the most. Next slide. Okay, this is just one of the last two slides here. We have a focus on environmental justice in Stockton. It's a focus area for our GSNR campaign. It's the only potential portlet of interest to GSNR. It's an environmental justice community that's meant to be given additional protections from AB 617 and SB 535. Stockton has some of the highest pollution burdens in California. They're in the 99th percentile. They have high rates of asthma. They have a high poverty rate. They are a non-attainment zone. And if GSNR is given the green light, that will mean more train and ship traffic, as well as the risks of fires and explosions. But we're determined to not let that happen, and we are lifting up the asks of the South Stockton community, as well as the concerned neighbors, which includes educating others about the EJ concerns about how GSNR is a false solution to other countries' renewable energy goals that are meant to mitigate climate change, and that is also a false solution to California's wildfire crisis. They also ask for folks to attend GSNR's board meetings and to place pressure on them, specifically asking that meetings are recorded, public comments should be included, and finally, that once the DEIR is released, that there's a minimum response time of 60 days. Next slide. And this is just about action. So GSNR is a really intersectional issue. It poses threats to community health and safety. It poses environmental justice risks. And there are community, climate, and forest ecosystem harms that could come if GSNR is to get a foothold. So right now, we are in the midst of the CEQA process. We are expecting a DEIR, that's a draft environmental impact report, anytime this quarter. It could be next quarter, but I'm saying anytime this quarter. And so we need to push back. This comes with organizing in Tuolumne and Lassen counties. This comes with supporting the Stockton community pushback and elevating the environmental justice asks. And this comes with educating. Industrial scale wood pellets have never had a foothold in the state of California. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done. This comes through forums like this, as well as letters to the editor and op-eds. I want to underscore that our coalition includes the Delta Sierra group of the Motherlode chapter. We also have had the statewide chapter support on our notices of preparation. So we're going to continue to ask for the Sierra Club support in this campaign. And if there's anything else that we can do to educate others or spread the word, we really want to help organizing there. So that's it. Thank y'all so much. I'm really happy to be here and happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Rita, for that very informative presentation. I know I learned some new things that I had not known before, and I'm sure everyone appreciates it. So we have a number of questions, and we will start with the very first one, which is actually really two questions. So the first question is from Maya: is the pellet industry the biggest problem? First question. And second, how do you deal with the fact that land managers and policy folks who are very much against GSNR are actually for biomass energy production locally?
Mm. I'm not exactly sure what you mean with the first question, if wood pellets are the biggest problem. I'm not sure if that means in relation to climate change or into forest management issues. I'll just say in relation to forest management issues that we're seeing, one of the reasons why there have been so many campaigns against wood pellet biomass manufacturing as well as wood pellet energy is because it's just the newest player on the block. It's a new kid on the block. And quite honestly, it's conflating issues between wood products and energy. And as far as it being needed for energy, which is the thrust behind the industry, it's supposed to be a renewable energy. It's supposed to be helping the European Union and the United Kingdom meet their energy goals. We don't think that it fits in the renewables club. In fact, we want to kick biomass out of the renewables club. We think that if emissions were properly accounted and taken into consideration, if you consider the upstream, the downstream, and the indirect emissions from the wood pellet biomass industry, and there were no subsidies, then the wood pellet biomass industry wouldn't exist. And so that's a huge reason why there are a lot of campaigns behind it, as well as the fact that those are some of our asks within the GSNR campaign. And then as far as the second question, I think that you said it was it about land management, Kristen? Could you repeat
Yeah,
the
the
second part
question
of the
was
question?
there are some people who are against GSNR but are for biomass
Right,
pelletization locally and
right,
incineration locally. And what do you make of that
right,
situation?
right. So NRDC focuses on industrial scale and usage of biomass because, there's a whole, as I said at the very beginning, when you were talking about what is biomass, there's a whole slew of definitions when it comes to biomass, right? And so we have to narrowly focus what we're going to be working on, and we have identified that as our issue. However, in partnering with other organizations and learning about the immense justice implications of a lot of different sorts of biomass and different scales of biomass, I think that there are many factors that have to be taken into consideration when you're pro or against it. And some of those main considerations, as far as what I've seen from being pro or against at the local level, really has to do with like what other energy sources there are, what is viable for that community. This is really just in relation to very rural communities up in Canada that may have no other source. And I'm not saying that NRDC is supportive of it. They're just recognizing that that community is also trying to find a way to have an energy source. And then the other thing at the other end of the spectrum is that biopower itself, bioenergy itself, is one of the dirtiest energy producers out there. So when communities are supportive of using small scale bioenergy, NRDC is willing to, concede that a local community should have autonomy in what they choose, and at the same time, they should be aware of the risks. And that really does center around the air pollution that can be associated with bioenergy. There was a recent study, actually, just back in January of this year, that identified that the air pollution that comes from biopower is about 2.8 times greater than any other sort of fossil fuel energy. And so that's just one of those considerations that communities need to take into account for themselves.
Thank you for that. So another question, how much did you say that GSNR has been subsidized in terms of dollars?
Yeah. So I think I said that when we were talking about the conflict of interest slide. Right now, they've received $12.5 million from Golden State Finance Authority, and that's actually in the form of a loan. They've also received $2.5 million from the Rural County Representatives of California in the form of in-kind donations. That's $2.5 million. The purest form of a subsidy that they have received is from the U.S. Forest Service. They actually received a $500,000 grant for wood products innovation. And I think that came between 2022 and 2023. The biggest amount of subsidies that they could be posed to receive are actually from foreign markets from foreign countries when they start producing pellets. It has been very clear in the documents that we've received from Public Records Act requests that they have not signed any contracts with any utility yet. And that is because everybody knows how important CEQA is in the state of California, and that GSNR has to go through a successful CEQA process for them to start producing pellets. So all the foreign markets and all those foreign countries are waiting for that to happen.
Thank you for that. Next question. Can you explain how biomass incineration is able to be called carbon neutral by some people?
It's very complicated. In fact, I just did a podcast with KBOO FM. They're up in Portland about the carbon accounting. There is a serious accounting loophole that stems back to the Kyoto Protocol, which was formed in the 90s, before my time, actually. And it comes down to how we account for emissions between the land use sector and the energy sector. And because biomass energy originates in the land use sector, the assumption is that the country where that energy source originated from will account for the loss, the carbon loss, in their own accounting framework. This is complicated because two of the main places that produce wood pellets in the world, the United States and our northern neighbor, Canada, were actually not party to the Kyoto Protocol. So the way that we account for our emissions is different from other countries that signed on to the Kyoto Protocol. And then furthermore, our approach to accounting for emissions from logging actually tends to obfuscate the intensive nature that logging has in relation to our forests and our carbon accounts for forests, because we use a netting approach. What this means at the end of the day is that we are supposed to be accounting for the loss of carbon in our own carbon accounting books, whereas burning countries get a free pass if they are importing biomass from another country. It was intended to eliminate double counting. I know this is really in the weeds, y'all, and I explain it better on the podcast, but it's intended to stop double accounting, but because it's not counted in the energy sector and because we don't count it in our own land use accounts, that means the emissions go poof as far as where they're accounted for in our global climate frameworks. And yet the atmosphere is still seeing increased emissions.
Yeah, Rita, I think that's a really important issue. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe send me offline the link to that podcast. We can send it out to our community when we send the link to our recording in case people are interested.
Yep, definitely.
So next question, should we try for federal laws to stop all timber harvesting of any kind for this use as fuels?
That's a really interesting question. So the way that we're working on forest biomass issues on the federal level is to make sure that they don't receive the same sorts of designations that biomass burning has received in the European Union, the United Kingdom, and in Asia. So we have a federal team that is working very hard right now, actually, to keep biomass as a renewable energy source. We want to exclude it from the IRA as well as the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. So there are a number of provisions in which we have to continuously defend against biomass being classified as a renewable energy source in the United States. It comes up every single year, like literally every single year that I've worked on this issue. There has been some bill that is proposed, and a senator or a representative will try to include it as a rider because there are a lot of timber-friendly producing states that want biomass to be considered carbon neutral so that it can be burned and incentivized the same way that it is in the European Union and the United Kingdom. Another form that it comes in as, like another Trojan horse for biomass carbon neutrality, is the Farm Bill. Many of y'all probably know the U.S. Forest Service sits under the USDA. And so the Farm Bill, sometimes they try to include it as a rider there. It's also been included as a rider in a number of spending bills. So every single year, no matter what, we know that we're fighting against biomass carbon neutrality. We have not seen any sort of legislative push against wood pellet biomass manufacturing. Unfortunately, I think that we would love to see that happen. Right now, in terms of forests, we are pushing for a mature and old growth rule that would protect mature and old growth forests. Right now, it's just old growth forests. It's been kind of watered down to old growth forests, to receiving lasting protection so that they aren't logged for any sort of product. That's what we're working on, more on the offensive side of things.
Great to hear. Next question. Can the EU, UK, and Asian nations be approached to stop subsidizing this biofuel that is not renewable energy?
Yes, yes, yes. My answer emphatically is yes. There are a lot of campaigns that are being run in European Union countries. There is a campaign in the United Kingdom called Cut Carbon, Not Forests. Y'all can check that out if you're interested in it. And we have a number of partners that are working in South Korea as well as Japan to push back against those renewable energy designations, because as we're all aware of, it's policy. It's a policy definition. Policy definitions can be changed, especially when we have the scientific community support behind those definitional changes. And it would be beneficial for the climate if we had proper carbon accounting around forest biomass energy. So my answer is emphatically yes. Other ways that we can get involved, for instance, Drax, which is the #2 pellet producer in the world. They're also the #1 bioenergy producer in the world, and they have a partnership with Drax. They have an annual shareholder meeting coming up. It's on April 25th. And community members and activists in the Southeast that have been fighting Drax for a long time now have actually started attending these shareholder meetings with proxy shares to lift their voices up there and make sure that they get some attention on Drax's bad behavior in that way. I mean, there are many avenues that we could think of as far as pushing back against this industry. And I think that foreign policy and intervention is definitely one of them.
Great. So here's a related question about the science. How is it possible that so many people, countries, and businesses have got the science so wrong on biomass incineration and pelletization?
Yeah. Honestly, it does go back to the Kyoto Protocol in the 90s. There was a carbon accounting loophole. The reason being is that they didn't want to have rule books like overloaded with emissions in two sectors. They wanted to make sure that they were just keeping it in one sector and we were being as accurate as possible. I think that the perverse nature of a market incentive like that is that it means, as I've said a number of times, once there's a market incentive for a particular product or a particular industry, it outstrips the ecological management decisions that would be helpful. So, when it's a true waste or residue, and this is entirely hypothetical because true waste and residues have never been used in the Southeast to create pellets. When it's a true waste and residue, there are limited emissions associated with that, because otherwise, theoretically speaking, that waste and residue would have been produced and it would have no end usage. That is the theory behind it. I will say that has never been the case. The very first investigation on wood pellet biomass manufacturing was done by the Wall Street Journal in 2013, and they found in viva clearcutting another 100-year-old bottomland hardwood forest in Virginia. So it's never happened. When there's a market incentive, it really outstrips the ecological inputs. The other thing I was going to say was that in relation to waste and residues for forest management, I mean, that's a much broader conversation. And I think it should include forest ecologists as well as soil scientists, because what I read is most recent science is that we actually need to be leaving waste and residues left behind from timber harvests to rebuild soil organic matter, to rebuild the structures that were lost when that timber was taken away, even to be able to reform the forest floor, like the physical form of the forest floor. I've seen recommendations to leave behind residues between 20 and 60%. And so that is why when it comes down to NRDC's recommendations about what we should be doing with waste and residues, for instance, in California, we're pushing towards ecological uses such as streamside management, such as lopping and scattering, leaving it in the forest as much as possible, because we're trying to value the carbon and we're trying to value the biodiversity.
Thank you. And there's a related question on this, which is, Do you know how many times can a plantation be harvested before it is essentially burned out? Is this another way that forest biomass is not truly renewable?
Gosh, that's a great question. I do not know. I don't know. I do know that the productivity does go down. I mean, we saw that in the Southeast. I know that the Pacific Northwest has experienced that as well. And then furthermore, in an era of climate change, when growing conditions are changing, um, I think that that question absolutely needs to be to be studied a little bit more. The problem with biomass, as I said, I think at some point when I was talking about investigations, is that biomass as an industry not only creates more logging, it creates worse logging. And when I said that, what I mean is that they are taking whole trees, right? GSNR has even indicated they're going to take 60% to 70% of their material is going to be whole trees from forests, but they can take a lot of other stuff. And by that I mean like they can take trees that are knotted, gnarled, crooked, stuff that no other industry can practically make anything out of. Those are the highest uses for biodiversity trees sometimes, right? But they also are trees that previously before haven't been able to be sold in the market. And so biomass does make logging worse in that more material is taken from the forest than before.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, on the action topic regarding the coalition, what statewide environmental groups are involved and active in the coalition in California to stop GSNR or any other coalition that you're dealing with across the West Coast?
Yep. So right now, our closest campaign partners, and I'll actually just say all of them from the local to the statewide to the more national, the groups that are focused on this, like on a week to week basis, include Natural Resources Defense Council, Center for Biological Diversity, Biofuel Watch, which I believe has given y'all a presentation before. We also work with Partnership for Policy Integrity. They are a national group. They also run a lot of campaigns in the European Union. Locally, we work with the Delta Sierra group of the Motherlode chapter, as well as Little Manila Rising. We work with Valley Improvement Projects, which does have a Stockton focus, as well as the Central Valley focus. In the rural counties, we're working with Ebbets Pass Forest Watch. We're working with We Act Through Environmental Review. We work with Mount Shasta Bioregional Ecology Center and Green America. We're also working with Green America. I know that I may be forgetting some. There have been hundreds of groups in California that have signed on to the notice of preparation. That was back all the way back in last June, which is wild. And the previous comments to that, which were signed back in November of 2022. So there are a number of groups that are alerted about this issue. We've also gotten the club's support, as I said before, but we're just looking to educate as much as possible about this issue because industrial scale biomass would be new. So understanding the threats is incredibly new. Up in Washington, there are so many great local groups that are pushing back against the facility Drax is proposing in Longview, Washington. That's really being led by a local coalition. And then as far as legal support up there, Earth Justice has been involved. And we've been in contact with our Earth Justice team in California too. So we'll see if they get involved at the draft stage for the environmental impact report.
And a related question, where does the Newsom administration, including the Natural Resources Agency Director Wade Crofit, stand on the GSNR projects?
That's a good question. We've got to push them on this. There have been a number of policies in California that have not necessarily been directly related to wood pellet biomass, but I would say have absolutely kicked the door wide open for this sort of project to be proposed, which means that there is quite a bit of education to be done in the legislature about the harms that wood pellet biomass could do to California. Other partners that we work with have a much better handle on the policy space in California and have worked there much longer than I have, as I said, and I'll always say I'm from the South. I'm not from California. I don't live in California. I do work in California, so I'm catching up to speed about each of the political positions in relation to wood pellet biomass. But California, for the most part, hasn't had a big industrial user like GSNR is posing to be in forests for quite some time. I think that that is definitely what distinguishes it, as well as it being for purely for exports, purely for export for other energy markets. I think that that's a concern. I think that any cover GSNR could potentially hope to gain from the Newsom administration would come under the guise of wildfire mitigation. And so that's why a lot of our partners are really focused on that task of debunking biomass as being a wildfire mitigation tactic.
Thank you. So a question about the sourcing area for the feedstock. And some folks have heard about a 100-mile radius, but it sounds like that might not quite be meaningful anymore. They've also heard all national forests. This is what this person is saying, is they're trying to figure it out. And they also heard that all national forests in California could be targeted for feedstock sourcing. So the question for you is, can you suggest a more shorthand way or an accurate way of describing the current sourcing area for GSNR?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and it changes depending on which day you ask GSNR where they're going to source from. So right now, the most recent sourcing maps that we have from them that I included in my slide deck probably are the best pieces of information to source from. And the really important part of that is that it includes forests of all different types, right? National forests, state forests, private forests. They don't care where it comes from. We did a GIS analysis with Center for Biological Diversity, and we've counted that there are going to be 16 national forests that are sourced from. This also includes forests in Southern Oregon as well as in Nevada. So we are making sure to try to increase our communications to include those communities as well, because even if it isn't coming from policy within their own state or a project proponent within their own state, it is going to impact their forests. So we're trying to increase the communications there. But, you know, honestly, GSNR is full of fluff. They have said many different things as they have developed this project since they formed in 2018. And we're going to have to wait and see how it materializes. We hope to never wait to see how it materializes because we would like to stop them before they even build their facilities. So yeah, so it's one part of me is like, well, we'll wait and see. And then the other part of me is like, no, we're going to stop them before that happens.
Right. Good plan. One asked, it's my understanding that the USFS Region 5 has a master stewardship agreement already with GNSR. Is this true?
Yes, this is true. They have a master stewardship agreement for 20 years. So that is why national forests will absolutely be sourced from. I think we have that master stewardship agreement and we've asked for GSNR to post it on their website as a resource.
Another question, different topic. Some wood pellets are used for residential stoves. Where do they come from?
Yeah, I mean, I am not sure. I know that there are 2 wood pellet manufacturing facilities already in California. They are of a much smaller scale, but they exist. The same thing goes with, there are a lot of wood pellet manufacturing companies for small scale wood heating in homes in New England, for example. And that's when you get into the history of forest biomass, you know, a lot of the original campaigns were actually up in New England. And again, as I said before, that predominantly relates to air pollution concerns. There's pollution no matter if you're burning it in a small wood stove or if you're burning it at a power plant. Yeah, but my understanding is that there are 2 existing wood pellet manufacturing facilities in California. They're much smaller scale. NRDC has never worked on them.
Okay. And this is an interesting track that we're on with these questions, because another person asked about what about kilns that burn biomass on a small scale, which you talked about, and what about those that produce biochar? Are those also polluting?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I do know that there are pollution concerns with all sorts of biomass heating. whether it's for small residential uses or at the industrial scale, which at the industrial scale, NRDC has done studies on it and worked with other organizations to do studies on it because we think that that should be regulated. We also don't think that they should be allowed to get away scot-free when they break the Clean Air Act or break emissions laws and emissions protocols in other countries. But at the small scale, I don't know. And unfortunately with biochar, I have not done any of that research on biochar. I have been asked about biochar from a number of folks. But we'll see if that really takes off in an industrial way. As of yet, it doesn't look like it has.
I see. Another question, is NRDC or any other environmental organization like Earth Justice that you know of planning on suing GSNR?
We're definitely preparing to. We definitely have our lawyers in the wings. We are watching them. We're making sure to ask for meetings or put in complaints to the Attorney General's office when we see fit. And we are preparing for their draft environmental impact report with our legal teams.
Thank you. So let's see, I'm looking for more questions. So another person mentions a few bills aimed at using pyrolysis to convert orchard and other ag waste to hydrogen.
Yeah,
They're wondering,
pyrolysis, yes.
yes, so they're talking about, so last Monday, legislators were talking about the woody ag waste in their districts that otherwise might be burned in the field.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, would this wood instead go to these wood pellets? I'm not sure if I totally understand the question, but yeah.
So as far as pyrolysis and hydrogen goes, I think the jury is still out as far as the emissions calculations. For us at NRDC, we've started talking to researchers to look into the total life cycle emissions and do a life cycle analysis on pyrolyzing a variety of biomass. That could include woody ag waste, such as orchard vines, such as, almond waste, that kind of thing, because we're not entirely sure. We think that is actually being incredibly downplayed at the hydrogen level. And we have a number of folks at NRDC who are much more familiar with this process than I am because they work on energy issues at the state and the federal levels. So I can look into that and see if I can send you anything about it. As far as that sort of waste material being used for industrial scale wood pellet production, we've never seen that happen. This goes back to something I was saying about pile waste. Another one of the arguments that we get in California about a reason or an argument for wood pellets is that it'll divert some of the slash burning that occurs as well as the pile burning that occurs that creates air pollution problems for communities. And unfortunately, that is really never panned out on the ground. And in fact, what we've really learned is that the wood pellet manufacturing facilities themselves, the engineering cannot handle material that is that small. And so from that, from that understanding and from that historical basis, I would say that they probably wouldn't be able to use that ag waste. It is a problem as far as I can see why policymakers are trying to address this in the legislature because there are rules against ag pile burning. The same doesn't apply to the forestry sector, but I think that there are a number of things that could be done about the pile burning. For instance, up in British Columbia, they have a carbon tax and they include the carbon emissions from pile burning to disincentivize pile burning and to incentivize other sorts of forest management decisions about what to do with waste and residues and leftovers. No matter what, whenever we're talking about the waste that are created by an industry, I think that it's great to try to come to solutions for that, but it's also skirting the fundamental issue of how wasteful these industries are and that they shouldn't be creating so much waste in the first place. The forest industry itself creates an incredible amount of residues and leftovers just from being sloppy. We could be doing so much better work in the forest at a much more sustainable scale if we were demanding that the industry be less wasteful in the first place.
I see. And I think you did answer the question because I think yeah, I think what the person was getting at is would the egg waste go into these wood pellets for GSNR? And it sounds like your answer is no.
Yeah, we don't believe so. We've never seen that happen, and I don't even think that the facilities can take that size of material.
Okay, thank you. So another person asked, can you flow chart over time the variety of funding streams that go into starting a project like this, like GSNR? Is
Oh,
Yeah, and they're wondering about where the lead agency, for instance, RCRC support comes in and other support.
that's a great question. We should do that. Whoever asked that, please reach out to me. We should do that. I think that that's brilliant. I've been wondering myself how GSNR is going to make this thing take liftoff. I think that one of the biggest concerns for us was that they signed an MOU with Drax. Drax is, as I said, like they're a big player in the wood pellet biomass world. And within that MOU, one of the most significant agreements that they listed out was that Drax was going to be helping them court external markets and find those utilities, which I don't think that GSNR would be able to do by themselves. Um, but it is going to cost them probably about $500 million to build both of these plants as well as the export terminal. It's a very costly process, and that is why the industry has built this model in the Southeast where they basically copy and repeat their plants. And they're trying to do it in these margins that are only viable based off of subsidies. So I think that that's an interesting question about what it's like for GSNR and as well as how the money has gotten there, like where it originated from. I think that that could be a great research project.
Thank you. Great. So I want to acknowledge to everybody, we're a little after the 5 o'clock hour Pacific time. We are planning to stay with Rita until a little before 5:15. And so I'll take as many questions as I can. And thank you so much for all your really amazing questions. They're really helpful to all of us. And we'll certainly, any question we can't get to, I'll certainly share with Rita so she can at least have them and provide food for thought, just like some of these other questions have. So the next question is two-part question. What do you expect the push from the state of California will be? And in other words, are you worried that CEQA is just a formality here, or will CEQA actually challenge this project?
Yeah, we hope that CEQA actually challenges this project. We're hopeful. We like the CEQA process at NRDC. We're going to engage with it. You know, we're ready for the draft environmental impact report to come down. We've been lining up our experts. We've been getting our legal team ready. We've faced the industry in a number of other states. So we're hoping that that experience can really arm us here. I'm not sure about what other form of support we could see from the state, but we are engaging and we're working on a legislative and an administrative strategy to, stop industrial scale biomass from getting a foothold in California. We think that GSNR is a campaign to work on not only to stop GSNR, but also because it's important to use it to educate California policymakers about the harms and the risks of industrial scale wood pellet biomass. And we're willing to engage with all the agencies that are going to be listed as responsible agencies. And we imagine that to be a quite a thorough list, right? We imagine that the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District will be listed, both Tuolumne and Lassen counties, obviously, the Port of Stockton commissioners. We imagine that there could be some political influence from CNRA, from Cal EPA, from others in the Gavin Newsom administration. And we also expect EPA Region 9 to potentially play a role because both of the facilities are going to need pretty sizable Title V permits that those counties can't handle. So we're preparing ourselves to engage with those agencies and do some education on the front end of things, as well as to be ready to work with them and have meetings with them throughout the draft environmental impact report stage. At this point, the most important thing for us when it comes to CEQA is actually pushing them to have a longer comment period time, to move it from the 30 to 60 days to potentially a 90-day window because of the amount of environmental justice concerns coming from the Stockton community. Given that they're already overburdened, they should receive adequate time in order to respond to this project in a meaningful way, with the understanding that they are overburdened and they have a lot of other impacts that they are responding to. So that is one of our primary leads right now, and that's what we're preparing to, first come to the fore with when we see that draft environmental impact report.
Thank you. So another question, isn't the whole objective of net zero or carbon neutrality the root problem that allows the forestry industry and the forest fuels industry to push biofuel schemes? That's the
Yeah,
question.
I think ideas around carbon neutrality, net zero play into it. It's similar, right? The whole reason why it receives this carbon neutrality definition or renewable energy designation is because trees grow back. And what we're trying to make clear is a tree grows back, but not in the time period that you need it to. And anybody can understand if you go out and you cut a 40-year-old pine from a pine plantation in the southeastern United States, or if you go out and you cut a 100-year-old bottomland hardwood from North Carolina, those are going to have carbon impacts, and we need to wait for the carbon payback period to be paid to truly be considered renewable energy, right? So that's the main thrust. I do think that there are similarities, between that and net zero, and I see the similarities.
Right. And yeah, it also has to come, it comes out of the soil too. So you
Yep.
also have to factor in the carbon in the soil.
Yep.
So a
Which we
question
barely
about,
understand. Yeah.
right, right. Yeah. So the question, another question, someone said the US Treasury Department was due to come out with its assessment by now as to whether the Inflation Reduction Act funds would go to the pellet industry or could go to the pellet industry. Or do you have any update on that?
Yeah, that's correct. That is correct, Intel. We expected it mid-April and we haven't seen it yet. We actually think that the Treasury Department is being a little bit slowed down right now, and we hope that that's positive. We actually think that they are sort of fundamentally questioning some of their carbon assumptions and trying to get more into the accounting right now. So we see it as a promising development. We also expect that they could come out with recommendations within the next month or so. So that's kind of our new updated timeline.
Thank you. Is biomass overseas used predominantly for industrial and commercial energy sources, or is it also part of a major residential energy source?
It's predominantly used at an industrial scale. It's both used for power, electricity, as well as heat. There are some combined heat and power applications, but they're all industrial scale, and they're all industrial scale. They're not going through residential heat markets.
Interesting. And someone asks, how is it burned? Is it burned in old coal facilities or otherwise?
Yep, that's a great question. So one of the slides of when I was talking about the supply chain of a wood pellet, I was showing the Drax cooling towers as the last picture because they're burned most likely and most often in old coal-fired power stations. The technology switch is not that expensive or difficult to do to retrofit a coal-fired power plant to be also able to be burned with wood pellets. So most often it's just a retrofit. I was just about to say in some cases there are new facilities built. I mean, it's really, really rare when there's a new energy facility that's built for wood pellets. I would have to go through the list again. More often than not, it's coming from a coal-fired facility that has been converted slightly to be able to burn or co-burn with wood pellets. In another way to look at it, right? It's extending the life of really dirty infrastructure.
Right. So I'll sneak in one final one and then we will close. So what about burying logs to sequester the carbon? Someone says it's hard to leave. Is it hard to leave everything on the ground as it causes more fuel?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So first of all, we cannot assume that leaving it on the ground actually increases wildfire risk. Our partners at Center for Biological Diversity don't believe that's the case and haven't found studies to back that up. So the recommendation from our coalition is still consider lop and scatter as being an alternative use. As far as burying it goes, unfortunately, most of the burying applications I have encountered include also building in a very thick plastic barrier, which is really deleterious for soil health. So at least on our soil and ag side of things, they've looked more thoroughly into the question of burying wood. And because it's so oftentimes coupled with this plastic barrier, their recommendation is that that's going to do more harm to the soil than good.
Very interesting. So with that, I want to say we had a number of additional questions, tons of interests, and I'll definitely send those to you, Rita. And we also have a lot of thank yous for you in the chat as well. So on behalf of everybody here, we want to really thank you for coming and sharing all this great information with us.
Yeah, thank y'all so much for allowing me to be here. I'm trying to represent NRDC as best as possible. Our coalition, I can't speak to if I represented them as well, but definitely try to. Y'all feel free to reach out to me at rfrost@nrdc.org. It's on the first slide that's going to be shared around. And yeah, we're just trying to be a resource as much as possible and share the scientific, factual information that we have as we prepare for this industrial scale user of our forests.
Thank you. And we will be posting the recording to this and the slides on our website, and so you can find it there later this week. And thank you so much, everybody, for attending.
So Rita, thank you very much for coming. This is Karen Mackey again. I want to say that our next forest forum is on May 20th, and Dr. J.P. O'Brien will be talking about Jackson's demonstration state forest.